The one thing that we could say about African peoples is that we left evidence of ourselves all over this planet. And that's the problem with European scientists. The deeper they dig, the blacker the planet gets. And what we have been made to see now is this infusion of European, I guess, philosophies about what the past was, and no one else on TV is actually giving us evidence of what we were, who we were, but Europeans.
Every person has the right to know their ancestral history. Every person, no matter where they are in the world.
Most of world history, 90% of world history is African history. And even that 10%, Africa is extraordinarily involved in making it what it is.
You won't find a painting, you won't find a statue, you won't find a monument anywhere prior to 1500 that isn't Africoid in some way, shape, or form.
Black folk don't have a problem. White folk got a problem. Black folk problem is that white folk got a problem. The real problem we have is white supremacy. The real problem we have is the perception people have of us.
From 1790 up until 1965, your immigration laws play almost zero for black folk. You had a zero immigration law for black folk because you're destined to be a planned minority. You know what a minority means? That means a loser. It means you're a loser.
It's very difficult to control a group of people militarily because eventually the money will run out if you try to control a group of people militarily. And also the possibility of them raising up against you is always imminent. So it's best to control a people psychologically.
When you conquer a people, you have two choices. One, you have to commit an act of genocide. Either you wipe them out completely, complete act of genocide so that you can take over the resources in the land. Or you kill the warrior class of these people and you enslave the children and the elderly. This is just war history. In our situation, meaning those that live in the United States, the choice was enslavement, not genocide. That means that from a child, you have to be taught that everything about you is wrong. Everything about who you were and where you came from is wrong. And I mean wrong, immoral and illegal.
Melanin is a neurochemical that is produced in part through the pituitary and the pineal gland. They both play a central role in the production of melanin, which is ultimately responsible for the color that we have in our skin. Now, historically, it had always been thought that melanin played a significant role in the intellectual propensity of African people. For example, when you study some of the Greek writings on melanin or the color of Africans, many of the Greek philosophers believed that melanin played some sort of a role in how Africans had been able to create and develop some of the sciences that they had come to be known for. So melanin was always considered an intellectual sort of a chemical.
The pineal gland, which produces melanin, it's shaped like a pine cone. And the origin of the word pineal literally means resembling a pine cone. Now, in ancient symbolisms, the pine cone has always been represented because people knew the importance of the pineal gland as it related to melanin and the universe.
Melanin is a molecule. And the concept of melanin is, it is black in its nature. And we find it in the cosmos, we find it in the heavens, we find it in water, we find it in land, we find it in everything that exists.
The sperm of the male and the egg of the woman, they're both layered with melanin, so that when the sperm penetrates the egg, there is a melanin explosion. And that melanin helps to formulate the fetus within that egg, and that fetus is literally coated with a melanin substance. And that melanin substance then goes on to form the brain and the central nervous system. So every human being begins with a melanin explosion.
Melanin is an intelligence. It's an intelligence because it is the dynamic, the primary dynamic in every part of the cell. It's a primary dynamic in the core of the human being as well as to the surface of the human being. Its intelligence is responsible for the forming of the nervous system. Every part of the nervous system has these little black dots all through it, which essentially carry information.
So melanin, from a physical standpoint, is that substance that accounts for what black people refer to as soul. We move differently, we walk differently, we talk differently because we have access to a different form of energy than other folk.
Not only is melanin a pigment, which is so obvious, but melanin as an intelligence is a communications module that essentially broadcasts as well as receives information by way of light and sound frequency signatures.
Scholars and scientists have been having conferences about melanin, to my awareness, at least since the 1920s.
The pineal glands of most of our white brothers and sisters are calcified, and so they make less melanin. And that comes from the historical relationship to what we call the Wormian Ice Age, that 10,000 years of glacial freezing that happened in Europe after the Africans who were the Grimaldi moved up there. And so it became the survival of the fittest. Who was able to adapt could survive, who wasn't able to adapt died. So those people who were able to get rid of their melanin was able to survive. Those who could not get rid of the melanin, they died.
These scientists said that the pineal gland, they refer to the pineal gland as a vestigial organ, that is a calcified gland within the body that served no purpose, as if the creator would create something that you didn't need. And it was only after the Vietnam War, in the late 60s and early 70s, that they began to rewrite their interpretation of the pineal gland. The reason for that was that a large number of African Americans fought and died during the Vietnam War. And whenever a soldier dies, there's an autopsy that's performed before their body is sent back to Dover Air Force Base. And what they discovered, what these physicians discovered, is that when they performed the autopsies, the 75 to 80% of the African American soldiers had a large functioning pineal gland. The pineal gland is normally about the size of your thumb. So it was not a vestigial organ in 70 to 80% of African Americans, but it is a calcified organ in 75 to 80% of people with European ancestry. So they began to reevaluate the pineal gland. They began to reevaluate melanin.
I think if you talk to Dr. Welsing, she'll tell you this is about genetic annihilation or genetic survival, okay? It's about genetics. Who will survive America? Who will survive the world? Whose genetics will hold up? What is going to be the genetic, or the genotype that's on the planet 1,000 years from now? Will it be white? Will it be brown? Will it be black? And so you find that the elements of the human family that find themselves suffering from the ecology that we're in, they're struggling to survive and to be able to maintain themselves. All nations, European nations and America, white Americans, are at minus birth rate right now. Not zero birth rate, where they're keeping up with the natural death. They're at minus birth rate. And so that's why there's so much emphasis on artificial birth creation and other ways to have babies and make babies that are beyond the normal. And you'll also find that this adopting black babies, the Haiti thing, getting the children out of Central African Republic and Chad, adopting Filipino babies, Latino babies by the white community on such a high level, it is to infuse their gene pool with the melanin.
A few years ago, the president of Chad, a man by the name of Idris Deby, he had a group of French charity workers arrested after it was found out that they were kidnapping children from that area. Now, Debbie accused them of stealing the children from their parents and planning to sell the children to pedophile rings up in Europe. He also accused them of possibly planning to kill the children to sell their organs. Now, this is the president of Chad saying this, and this was a big scandal with the Chadian government and the French government. So we need to understand everything that's going on with people going into Africa trying to get these children up out of here.
There's a war being waged on melanated people, and melanated people, people of color, should realize that a war is going on. A lot of melanated people do not realize that this war is going on, and this war is going on an educational front. There's a spiritual warfare, there's a medical warfare, there's a prison industrial warfare, and there's an economic warfare being imposed on people of color, especially in America. If you want to convince a group of people that everything about them is negative, what you have to do is tell them where they're from is a negative place. And this is what they've done to black people. They say, black people, you're negative, you're bad, because Africa is negative and Africa is bad. So the images that we have of Africa, we always see the underbelly. We always see the propaganda. We always see the warfare, but they never show the other side.
One of the things that I've discovered about conquered people is that most conquered people have had their ancestral memory erased, and they only know what missionaries or enslavers have taught them, and usually it's negative.
There is good, there is bad, there is advancement, and there is a lack of advancement in all cultures. The problem is that this society tends to want to show you the extended belly of a baby in Ethiopia. It wants to show you the negativity of Africa.
People think Africa and Asia and Guatemala, Southern America, these places were all jungle. Jungle came after the invasions of European colonialism. Then the jungles came in because nobody was manning the land anymore.
Look at the map. Just this map tells you alone that the great majority of Africa is grassland. It shows you right here. It's grassland, no jungle. In fact, the Everglades, by proportion, there's more jungle in the Everglades than there is proportionately in Africa, and that's in Florida.
There's more jungle in Europe and in Asia than there is in Africa. Without a doubt, Africa has its wetlands, it has its greenery, some of the most beautiful animal kingdoms in the world. But most of Africa is not jungle. There's more jungle on the other continents than there is in Africa. In fact, you have vast greenlands in Africa, miles, tens of thousands of miles of nothing but flat, beautiful green land.
Whenever they show images of Africa, they like to show the hunter-gatherers, the bushmen, the brothers running around half naked with sticks. And that really represents about 1% of the whole population of Africa. As a matter of fact, you have those same hunter-gatherer people up in Europe. There's a group of people called the Sami people who live just like that, who live in mud huts, and they live that hunter-gatherer experience. But you never see any kind of mention of them in the media. You only see the African Bushmen, but you never see the rest of the whole continent and see how people are really living over there. Whenever you look at old Tarzan movies or old cartoons from back in the 1920s and 30s, they would always show the cannibalistic African person dancing around in the jungle with a big pot, putting in missionaries, cooking them and eating them. And that's a major myth about Africa because there is no evidence of any kind of cannibalism going on in Africa.
There is no evidence of cannibalism in Africa. In fact, if you read a book called Man-Eater, there's more references to Europeans eating each other in the cold than there is Africans eating each other in the warmth. Why are you going to have a need to eat each other when the Creator and the Son has given you mango and peanuts and food to eat that comes to you plentifully? There's no evidence of it, but again, to denigrate Africa and Africans, they have to create an image that people are going to shy away from.
There's so many fallacies about African people and African history and culture, and cannibalism is one example. You know, based on my study, I found more evidence of cannibalism practiced among Europeans in Virginia in the 1600s. There are documented cases of the first settlers coming to Virginia from England, coming here in fall and in the dead of winter, and not having enough supplies to see them through that season. So there's documented instances of people exhuming the bodies of the dead and eating them. There's one particular instance, I forget the gentleman's name, but actually I read this in a National Geographic magazine about a man whose wife died and he kept her death a secret so that he could eat her corpse and survive the winter.
The cannibalism was going on in Europe big time. There's a lot of evidence showing the cannibalism that was going on in Europe. As a matter of fact, this whole vampire phenomenon that we have is rooted in the cannibalism that was going on in Europe in the Middle Ages. One of the most famous vampires, Dracula, Count Dracula, is really based on a real person named Vlad Dracula, who's also known as Vlad the Impaler. And there's a very famous portrait of Vlad the Impaler from around 1499, sometime in the 1400s, showing him and these people that he impaled on the stake. But they only show half of this portrait, because when you pan out of this portrait, you will see Vlad the Impaler literally at a dinner table eating the body parts. And I mean, he has like knife, fork, salt and pepper, like he's at Applebee's or Denny's or something.
You have to remember at the time, Isabella, or the queen at the time, put a bounty on slaves. And part of the edict that she sent out was anyone or any of the people that you catch who are cannibals, you can enslave them. So now everybody would say, okay, they were cannibals.
Another myth about Africa is that it's extremely violent. Whenever we see anything about Africa, especially movies and the news, we always see the African warlord. We always see the African rebels riding on trucks, the African rebels with rocket launchers and machine guns. So what they do, the Western media, they'll take footage of a war-torn area. And the footage might even be old. They'll get old footage and show war-torn areas of Africa. They did that with the Coney 2012 propaganda not too long ago. And they'll try to pretend that this is what all of Africa is like. But in reality, out of the top 10 countries around the world with the lowest violent crime rates, 6 of those countries are in Africa, like Senegal, Cameroon, Mali. A lot of people don't know that. In an attempt for Western powers and European historians to distance Africa from Egypt, because they try to pretend that Egypt and the rest of Africa is totally different. So what they did, they created something called the Sub-Saharan African, meaning that the Africans below the Sahara Desert were somehow disconnected from the Africans in the north. Africans have always interacted with each other all over Africa. Africans have always moved around Africa. Even the Sahara Desert, it was not always a desert, number one. Number two, the Nile River goes from North Africa right into Southern Africa. So if they wanted to go back and forth from North Africa to Southern Africa, they can just take the Nile River.
Now, one of the things we have to be concerned about is the concerted effort to take Egypt out of Africa. And so many times when people speak of Africa, they exclude Egypt. And I think, and many people I think would agree with me, many of my colleagues and contemporaries, they would say that excluding Egypt from Africa would be like taking Greece and Rome out of Europe. It's just a huge void.
The more south you go, the more African-centered you'll get. As you move more north, their attachment to those structures are just not there. There's a lot of reasons why that happens, just in terms of they know it's not them. They know it's not their mindset. They know that they want to exploit it, but they do not know it. It is not part of them. They are an invading force. For them to be in Egypt today is equivalent to Europeans claiming America of 3,000 years ago.
And they could care less about those temples because, number one, they didn't build them. And from an Islamic perspective, they really wouldn't like to see them in existence. The reason they're there is because they are a moneymaker for the Egyptian government. Let's be clear.
A lot of the Egyptians that are there in Egypt now, they're invaders. They came later on down the line. They're not
the ancient Egyptians. They're not connected to the ancient Egyptians, and they know that. When they're over there, they don't respect the ancient monuments as their own. Like when you go to the mosque over there, they respect the mosque. They're not over there smoking cigarettes. They're not selling things in front of the mosque. But when you go to the pyramids and you go to the museums, you go to the Sphinx, people, they're out there hustling. They're out there trying to sell you things. They're smoking cigarettes. They're out there running scams. They're running game on you.
Right.
Can you see this picture? We know this picture?
Yes, but let me see that. What was that? Hold on.
Mr. Obama.
That's Barack Obama?
Obama was my father.
Barack Obama was your father?
Yeah, in the Panorama Place. And then maybe later.
When the white scientists go into the temples of Kemet to excavate and clean up the walls and temples and make them visitable and inhabitable, they are changing the color of the actual paintings of the Africans on the wall. There was an entire report that came out how the scientific excavators in the temples of Kemet were lightening up the images on the wall, the Medu Neter. So you have black images, and they're using chemicals that actually turn the black image tan.
Professor Smalls told me when he went to study over there, he said the reason why we over here in the West are so caught up with ancient Kemet is because the seeds of Kemet, after Kemet was destroyed, all were driven to the south and to the west of Africa. And during the time of the slave trade, the strangers were the ones that they gave up first. So the people who actually are the ones that were brought over here were the remnants from ancient Kemet. They too, the people of Mali and the people of these areas that you're seeing with the Dogon, they say that the Dogons themselves are the forgotten parts of those tribes that actually ended up or who were driven out of ancient Kemet.
The Dogon were a group of Africans from the West Coast who had in fact been able to achieve a degree of astrological superiority and dominance that we really don't see a contemporary for or precedent for other than what was achieved in Nile Valley civilization.
And people began to chase the Dogon to examine them because you couldn't figure out how these so-called primitive Africans would have knowledge of astronomy, particularly the white dwarf star Sirius B, that Western astronomy itself is only coming to grips with. And so the Dogon have developed a kind of, I almost said infamy in the world. In fact, there's even a book called The Sirius Mystery, and it's about how the Dogon, these primitive Africans, could have knowledge of a star system that's invisible to the naked eye. So the Dogon are black people in Mali with an astronomical lore.
Whenever we see people in Africa, we always see the AIDS-infested African babies, the African people. But what they do not talk about is the AIDS that's going on in Europe. Most people don't know that most of the new AIDS cases today are not in Africa. Most of the new AIDS cases today are coming out of Eastern Europe, out of Russia, the Ukraine, and there's an AIDS epidemic over there in that area, but you never hear about it in the media.
Nations are invaded at the end of their power. If you look at all of the great nations that rose, when nations are invaded, the nation itself is sick already. Only dying nations are invaded. Nations act like animals to each other. If the state is strong, which means it is in a constant state of war. It is continuously fending off what it doesn't want. And not war always shooting and killing. Commerce wars, trade wars, competitions, even sports. The state is always in a constant push off, and let in. We want this. Acquisition. We want that. We gonna take that. Give and take. When another state starts to get weak because its people are unskilled, becomes ignorant, betray the king or queen or the ruling class, or the ruling class becomes tyrant and the people can't control the people anymore, any of these things, you lose your resources, just your state starts to deteriorate. The minute your state starts to deteriorate, other states are looking at you. It ain't got nothing to do with we love you, we knew you, we know your family. As a matter of fact, we'll take you in. You go into exile and come on into our state and come on in, but we taking your land, your resources. Why? Because you weak.
How can Africa be so poor and yet be materially so rich? It's real simple. The answer lies in the Structural Adjustment Programs, SAP, the Structural Adjustment Programs that are imposed on African nations by the International Monetary Fund of Washington, D.C., the World Bank of Washington, D.C., and USAID. These three organizations come into Africa, loan money, and then charge an interest rate on that money that they know the African nations can never pay back, thusly re-enslaving the entire nation and, in fact, the entire continent.
I point out that when Spanish, English, Dutch explorers would go through, let's say, the Americas, because a good example here for the African continent, many of the places they arrived at were already abandoned. Our tribes leaders, our kings and queens, our priests, traveled the world. They were literate. They read and spoke many languages. They heard and knew. These guys are coming to take over the land. They got weird weapons, and this is what they're gonna do. They went back to their tribe, told everybody, gather up your stuff. We have to leave. There is an invading force coming. We have to go. So many tribes were warned. When this invading force came, many times they came and found the place deserted and just claimed it as their own.
Why was Muammar Gaddafi killed? Muammar Gaddafi was murdered because he, along with the other African heads of state, were about to bring into existence Africa's first central bank. They were erecting a central bank in Africa, which was going to do what? Back its money to the resources under the ground in Africa. Now, what would that have done to the global economic order? Remember, the United States dollar isn't backed on any natural resource. The British pound isn't backed on any natural resource. The Canadian dollar, the European Union, their currency isn't backed on any natural resource because Europe doesn't have a lot of natural resources. Africa does. So if they would have been successful in creating a central bank of Africa, coming up with a unitary currency, and then backing that currency to the material wealth under the soil, they would have bankrupted every other economic system in this world from America to Europe to China. That was revolution, and that's why Muammar Gaddafi had to be assassinated, because he was about to help the African heads of state eliminate modern slavery and neocolonialism from the continent.
One of the things that you find is that European culture begins to take off after the first civilized Europeans, the Greeks, make contact with Kemet or Egypt.
Greeks themselves were not white people, and even today, you any Greek, I was in the military, I was stationed in Athens and Piraeus. We know we're cousins, let's stop playing.
We still have black Greeks living in Greece right now to this day, and people pretend they don't know where they came from, but there are black Greek people living in Greece right now.
People of Ireland long before, and the people of Scotland long before the Romans came, were already African peoples. If you see a picture of a Scottish person, there's always somebody with like this real thick black hair, right? And this real thick black, what do you think they're trying to tell you?
You know, they came out with a report a few years ago saying that King Tut shared DNA with men up in Britain. And the thing is, the Egyptians went into Britain, particularly Scotland, later on down the line. As a matter of fact, Scotland is named after an Egyptian princess, Scotia. And Many of the descendants of those Egyptians are there to this day, but they're now known as gypsies. And the term gypsy is just a variation of the word Egyptian.
Whites have long hair, blacks have short curly hair. What is the reason for that? Black's hair, your follicle, my follicle, is not round, it's flat, like a ribbon. So you know how Christmas you rub your hand on the ribbon and it curls up? Well, that's the way our hair do. White hair is like a soda straw. It's round, so it hangs. What is the purpose for that? All of the main arteries that take the messages and information from the brain to the rest of the body pass through the human neck. So if you're caught in an ice age, you've got to grow enough hair to shield the neck, to insulate the neck. Otherwise, you're gonna die. Same thing with the nostrils. When you're in the sun of Africa, you need these big nostrils we have because you gotta cool the brain down. But if you're in Europe and all that ice, you don't wanna cool the brain down. So you need a smaller nostril bridge so you can warm the air up that's coming in. These simple physical anthropological realities.
The Greeks lost their history, all of it. Okay, the Greeks lost all their history. You know who had their history? The Arabs had the Greeks' history. The reason we know Greek history is because of Islam. Because of the Arabs revered Greek history. And what the Greeks were doing and all their philosophies, they wrote it all down. Then Greece lost their history through wars and this and that and the other. And they regained their history because of Arabic texts.
Oh, thank heaven for 7/11. Oh, thank heaven for 7/11. What's 7/11? 7/11 was when the Moors, Africans from Morocco, which is where the word Moor comes from, but Africans from northern Africa went across the Iberian Peninsula, which is a very short distance, into Europe. And they brought culture. They brought writing, they brought civilization, and they brought Europe out of the Dark Ages.
It was the Romans that began to call the black people in Africa. Remember that day we didn't speak English. So if you don't speak English, you're not gonna call yourself black, right? So if you don't speak a traditional African language or Portuguese or Spanish, you will not call yourself Negro. At that time, Spanish was not dominant, so there's no Negro, there's no Portuguese. At that time, English is not dominant, so there's no black. At that time, the Romans were the dominant force, and the Roman word for black persons was Moorish, coming from the Greek roots for black.
They occupied Portugal. They occupied parts of southern France.
Up until 1700s, all the medical books on surgery and general medicine in Europe was written in Arabic. Isn't that extraordinary? All of the major universities of Europe, where the physicians and the scientists and the teachers were all studying, was in Spain and Portugal, run by the Africans that the West call Moors. And the reason the West keep emphasizing them as Moors, they don't want you to see that this is the same African we got enslaved that gave us all the wealth of knowledge that allowed us to enslave you.
At this time in Europe, we're talking the early 8th century, most European kings and queens could neither read or write. The Moors built vast libraries. Anybody, irrespective of your religion, you could practice your religious faith, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, in relative freedom. We find Moors in the army of the Spanish Emperor Trajan. In fact, in Italy, you have what's called Trajan's Column, and you can see more clearly Moor soldiers on horseback on that column. You can go to Rome and see it for yourself. You have at least one emperor in Rome of Moorish ancestry. His name is Macrinus. He's specifically described as a Moor. You have other high-ranking Moors in the Roman army.
The Moors were known for building castles all throughout Europe, and some of those same castles can actually be found around North Africa. They call them desert castles or kazirs, but they are castles all around Africa.
The heart and soul, the thought, the mind that built the castles came from Africans. And they went through Europe and they built these. They built them straight through Spain, straight through Portugal, going up into France, going up into other parts of the world.
The earliest examples of castle building I found in an area that is now known as Nubia. If you were to go to the Nubia Museum in Aswan, Egypt, you'll find a model of a castle complete with a moat, drawbridge, fortifications, all of the architectural elements that we associate with castles in any part of Europe existed in Africa as late as 1800 BC, before there was civilization in Europe.
The Moors are described in English literature or European literature as black as pitch, black as a crow, black as a raven, black as ink, nothing white about them but their teeth.
The monument that we know is Stonehenge. A European writer by the name of Gerald Massey said in one of his books that Stonehenge was built by an African man named Mauryan. Now, this is from a European writer, because a lot of times when black historians say something like this, it's written off as being Afrocentric. But European writers and several other European writers say that African people built Stonehenge and other monuments up in Europe.
Only when the enslavement of Africans started to produce wealth for Europe that this notion of color racism began to become a reality. Most of the great saints of Europe are black. Almost every church in Europe have a black Madonna and child.
Saint Calogero was another patron saint of Italy. He was a black man, and there's black statues of this man all over Italy, and there's paintings of Saint Calogero all over Italy and Sicily. They worship this man in Sicily. They still have statues of many Moors up in Europe today. They have a statue of Saint Benedict that was made in the 1700s. There's another bust carving of Saint Gregory that's in a museum in Germany. So there's statues of Moors and African people all over Europe to this day that you can see, but you got to go to museums to see them. They're very quiet about them. You have to go over there, and also you have to learn about these things in different languages, because they keep that history hidden because they'll put it in another language. The ivory bangle lady was an African woman whose tomb they found up in the York area of Britain. Now, whenever they find African people in Britain, what they would normally do is just try to write them off as being slaves, or they might have been a slave. It's a possibility that they were slaves. But with the ivory bangle lady, they couldn't write her off as a slave because it showed that she had so much wealth, she could not have possibly been a slave. The way her tomb was made, it was made out of stone, which showed wealth. Inside the tomb, it had all types of artifacts and jewelry, like ivory bangles and necklaces and bracelets on her wrists. And it showed that this woman was extremely wealthy. Johannes Morris was a 13th century high-ranking official in Italy. And there's a carving, a statue of him at a museum in Italy right now. And this statue of Johannes Morris shows his clearly African features, African nose, African lips, African hair.
Look at the countries that are falling. Almost by chronology, they're falling the same way they invaded Africa. Greece is falling, Italy is falling, Spain is falling, Persia is falling. And it's all because what goes around comes around. No hocus pocus, no mumbo jumbo, this is just the way it is. You shall reap what you sow. That's not a biblical term, that's a scientific term.
When you read the European philosophers, what did they say? They often said that Africa had two great civilizations, Egypt in the north and Asia in the south. The white man said this. So they often, in ancient times, Asia was considered a part of Africa or Africa's second civilization. They said that you go to Asia and it's nothing but a carbon copy of Africa because it was settled by the Africans.
A lot of people don't know that there are pyramids all over Asia, and there are pyramids in China. In Japan, they have an underwater pyramid that a lot of people don't know about, and you can go there now, and that's one of those ancient mysteries. But again, pyramids are all over the planet.
So in Asia today, you have pockets of black people. You have the Mani. You have in southern Thailand, you have a related group in northern Malaysia, sometimes called Sakai, S-E-K-A-I. You have the Andaman Islanders, and there are at least two groups. One group is called the Onge, O-N-G-E, or O-N-J-E, I think it's O-N-G-E, and another is called the Jawara, J-A-R-A-W-A. And then you have black populations in the Philippines. sometimes called Negritos or Eta, or I think we should call them Acta, which just means the people. You have a tradition of a similar group in Taiwan. These are the diminutive Africoids. These are the small blacks, similar in many ways to the Twa or so-called pygmies in Central Africa. These are very, very ancient people who left Africa perhaps 60, 70, maybe 100,000 years ago and became isolated.
The Padang people, that's a group of people in Asia, and the women have these rings that they wear on their necks that's identical to an African tribe of women in East Africa who wear the same type of rings on their necks. So this just shows that the African-Asian connection is still there. They still carry on some of the African cultures and traditions in certain parts of Asia.
I once had a professor of mine working on my doctorate tell me that she went to Japan and they went into the mountains of Japan. Now, this isn't a conscious woman by most definitions, but she couldn't wait to come back and tell me this. She said, Umar, I was in Japan. We went up into the spiritual temples of Japan, and we sat down in one of the temples waiting for the priest to come out and teach us a little bit about what they believe and what they stand for. She said, Umar, they walked out of the temples and their skin was just as black as ours. They had gray afros because they were elders. Now, she said the phenotype looked like the modern Asian, but she said the skin was black and they had gray afros, hair standing up on top like Don King. And she said it totally overcame me. They sat down and they began to talk. And she said, I couldn't believe these were black men. They were Japanese, but they were black men.
When I went over to Indonesia, I went there at night and I would see billboards of very light-skinned Asian Indonesian people. And then when I went to my hotel, I would go and watch these movies and I would see these very, again, light-skinned, pale-skinned Indonesian Asian people. But the next day when I went out into the streets of Indonesia, everybody was either my color or darker. I didn't see one person who looked like these people that were on the billboards and on television. So they would pick and choose and get the whitest looking Asian people to promote in the media over there. And when I walked around Indonesia, I saw people like jet black, dark. I ran into a couple of people with afros. I saw one Asian brother, full-blooded Asian guy with an afro, and I had to stop him. I said, brother, where are you from? And the brother was like, I'm from here, right here in Indonesia. So that African presence, that African phenotype is still throughout Asia to this day.
Look at the Buddha's hair. No Chinese person's hair looked like that. The Buddha has knotty hair. Every time you see the Buddha, his hair is knotted. Just a thought.
There's a painting called the Nambam painting of the Portuguese when they first go over to Japan. And when you look at this painting, the painting was made in around sometime in the 1500s, and it was the first eyewitness account of what they saw. Many of the Asian people there were dark-skinned, and half the people who were supposed to be Portuguese were dark-skinned.
There's a tradition begun by a man named Alexander Francis Chamberlain, at least in April 1914, in a publication called the Journal of Race Development. And I can quote him almost exactly. And he says, and even in far-off Japan, we can find traces of the ancient Negro. For when the Japanese armies in the 8th century, now here I'm paraphrasing, when the Japanese armies in the 8th century were fighting their traditional enemy, the Ainu, they were led by a famous Negro general named Sakanoye Tamura. And this man became the first shogun in Japanese history.
Also in Malaysia, when I went down to Malaysia, I went into the rainforest over there. And it's very difficult to get over to some of these spots. Some of these people there are very secluded. And because they're secluded, they were able to avoid many natural disasters, and they were also able to avoid invasions. So they didn't mix in with some of the invading forces, so they kept their same African phenotype. And if you go to Malaysia, there's a tribe called the Batek tribe, and they look like an African tribe. If you go there, they have woolly hair, African nose, lips, everything about these people looks like an African tribe.
one of the things we know about white supremacy and light skin supremacy, because even when you look at Asia, even when you go to East India, they practice racism. Why? Because all of these places were colonized by the European and their culture infected the people. So one of the things that they do is they also have a tendency to do what? Hide the darker brother.
As a matter of fact, there was an incident that happened with Miss Fiji. They had the Miss World competition, and they chose this woman to be Miss Fiji. And Miss Fiji has more Europeanized features, and the people of Fiji spoke out against her. They weren't really trying to hate on her, but they said, look, this woman doesn't represent us. She doesn't look like us. She doesn't have our nose. She doesn't have our hair. And we're very proud of what we look like, and we want somebody to represent us. Because again, they were trying to use that Europeanized Miss Fiji to bring in tourism and not scare away tourists. But the people spoke out against her. And this just shows that many people around the world, they're proud of their Africoid features. One of the oldest groups of people to inhabit India were a group of black-skinned people called the Dravidians, or the Untouchables. Now, when people think about the history and the culture of India, they oftentimes think of Mahatma Gandhi. And many people give praises and accolades to Mahatma Gandhi because of Dr. Martin Luther King. But what many people do not know is that Gandhi had very racist views towards black people.
The truth behind Mahatma Gandhi. First of all, I'm reluctant to use the word Mahatma. Mahatma means great soul. And many of my Indian colleagues would say he wasn't even an ordinary soul, much less a great soul.
The late, great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. put that picture of Mahatma Gandhi up in his office and said that he got the operational technique for nonviolence from Mahatma Gandhi. It was somewhat premature for the ancestor, who's one of my favorites, but it was premature because now you automatically set the stage where African people would start looking to Mahatma Gandhi also. For example, last spring, last Black History Month, I was in Atlanta. I went to the Dr. Martin Luther King Shrine where he and Queen Mother Coretta are buried, and across the street is a museum. Outside the museum is a life-size statue of Mahatma Gandhi. I couldn't believe it. This is a museum dedicated to the honor of Dr. King. But there's no statue of Dr. King outside of a museum erected in his honor. Instead, you have a life-size statue of Mahatma Gandhi. So the message to the child is what? That it was really Mahatma Gandhi who's responsible for you coming through the civil rights struggle, not Dr. King. Now, had Dr. King knew Mahatma Gandhi's true racist thinking and ideology, I'm sure he would have thought otherwise. As a psychologist, you can never know what's really at the root of somebody's thinking. I would argue that we should never make a hero of any other people. Mahatma Gandhi turned his back on Africans. Even when he came back to India and began fighting, he refused to give support to the African emancipation movements. And on more than one occasion, he had made derogatory remarks about Africans. And we also know the Dravidians of India, the Africans of India who are oppressed, were oppressed, and have always been oppressed in India. There is no record anywhere of Mahatma Gandhi fighting against the oppression of Indians in India who were black, the so-called Dravidians. Why didn't he speak out for them? Why didn't he speak out for Africans who were fighting against colonialism? Why didn't Mahatma Gandhi help our brothers and sisters in South Africa? It's because he was a racist like the rest of them.
First of all, Australia itself is the world's second smallest continent, second only after Antarctica. It's the smallest inhabited continent. The name Australia means Great South Land. And the first people of Australia were the people we call Aboriginal Australians, commonly called blackfellas. And of course, you have different names, the Koori, the Goori, the Noongar, and various names.
The people of Australia, originally Australia was an African land. In fact, in European documentation, they considered it an African satellite. When the British came into Australia and began the mass extermination of African people, they were crystal clear who they were exterminating because they said it. And also we know that right off the coast of Australia was an island called Tasmania, a little island off the coast of Tasmania. There are no living Tasmanians in existence right now. You can't find a Tasmanian man, woman, or child because the British systematically exterminated the entire population.
It wasn't until January 1967 that Aboriginal people in Australia were considered humans for the first time. In January 1967, there was a national referendum to decide if Aboriginal Australians should have Australian citizenship. Up to that point, they were officially, and you can document this, classified as flora and fauna and plants and animals.
In Australia, they would literally breed out the melanin of the people. You know, they would have these, they would take the children and take them to breeding camps and breeding farms and breed the darker ones and the mulatto ones with white, and they would literally breed the melanin out of these people. The movie Rabbit Proof Fence is about that breeding process, them breeding out the melanin of the Aboriginal people. So it was very deep what was going on over there.
You have three major island chains: North Pacific, West Pacific, and South Pacific. Melanesia, Polynesia, Micronesia. Melanesia is the South Pacific. That means the Black Islands. And the biggest island is New Guinea. Others include New Caledonia, New Ireland, New Britain, Fiji, the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, which used to be known as New Hebrides. These are the Black Islands. And the people that I've encountered in this part of the world tend to say they come from Africa. People tend to have very, very Africoid features: dark skin, tightly curled hair, you know, large afros, we call them today. Many of them say they come from Africa, especially in Fiji. And also in Buka Island. And I ask people, where do you come from? We come from Africa. And they're very matter-of-fact about it. Buka, B-U-K, means black skin. And they have the reputation of being the blackest human beings on earth. So quite naturally, that was where I wanted to lay my head. Look at images of King Kamehameha, and I know you have, who is what might be considered the founder of Hawaii. It's like the founding father of Hawaii. Clearly Africoid.
One of the most famous Hawaiians is a guy named Duke Kahanamoku. Duke was one of the forefathers of modern surfing, and they would use Duke to promote tourism in Hawaii. They would send Duke to the continental United States to promote swimming in Hawaii and surfing, and Duke had problems getting into swimming areas when he came to the continental US because people thought that he was black because he was so dark. And many of the native Hawaiians, they have that dark African phenotype. If you go to places like Maui and some of the remote areas of Hawaii, they look like black people, just like Samoans. You go to Samoa, they look like black people over here in America.
I'm doing an interview, a call-in thing, and somebody called in and says, you know, I'm a Hawaiian. And he says, the problem was you just didn't meet the right people. I said, really? He says, when I was a young boy, my grandmother used to tell me that when Kamehameha was trying to unite the Hawaiian Islands, this is around 1815, that he ran into trouble and he sent back to Africa for reinforcements. He said that was a Hawaiian tradition.
African people, they've been coming to the Americas for years, thousands of years before Europeans. And this is why many Europeans knew how to get over to the Americas based on maps that African people left for centuries.
We wear the gene pool of the Native American population. We wear the gene pool of the African, which is called Moors, who had preceded Columbus to this country. And we wear the gene pool of those Africans who came from the continent. And so we felt that this land, and I do now still feel this land is ours. I'm an African American. Africa is my race. America is my geopolitical place. I'm not surrendering that to anybody.
One of the things we know is there are Europeans who wrote books about the African presence in America before Columbus, but it's difficult to actually get your hands on some of the copies of these books. They're real hard to find because it wasn't popular for white folk or black folk, but especially white scientists, to say that African folk, that Moorish people were in America prior to the European coming here.
There are 3 belts that leave the coast of Africa. There's one that's in the north, there's one in the middle, and there's one in the south. When you look at this middle one literally will take you right into the Gulf of Mexico, even if you didn't have power boat. And what's going to happen is the Africans are going to start to move into this area here, and they're going to begin to settle in this corner of the Gulf of Mexico. They're going to develop, according to what our research shows, 3 major cities: Tres Zapotes, San Lorenzo, okay, and La Venta.
If you go to Mexico, southern Mexico now, especially in the provinces and towns in southwest Mexico, they'll tell you there's 2 black people there. The ones that came on the ship, meaning those who were enslaved, and the ones who came before the ship, meaning those like the Olmecs and others who had been here at a point where no one knows when that genesis was. They just were always here.
The Olmec problem was that European scientists, after finding it, it was found by a little farmer who was clearing the land for him to grow some maize and grow his corn. And he found what looked like an upside-down pot. And when he called the owner of the land over, they found out what it was, and he excavated it, and they found this gigantic head. Now, that was back early in 1837 or 1897 or something around that time. When they found that and they saw this Africoid face, that completely turned everything around, because they thought the Mayan civilization was the oldest civilization here. Now, when they found that the Mayan civilization was not the oldest civilization, and that Africans all through the histories were supposedly brought here as slaves, they did not want to fess up and change their whole curriculum to state that there was an African civilization in the Americas some 5,000, 10,000 years ago. The other part of it is that during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, the Vatican put out an edict very quietly that all Western books and academia had to first be passed through the Vatican census. So the Vatican said that any evidence of black history here had to be taken off of the history book. This man, Coe, who essentially became the top man that you went to see about Mesoamerican civilization, he worked for the CIA.
When I was down there in Mexico, I saw one Olmec statue. It was very interesting to me. It had the face of an African person, and the name of the statue was actually called Monkey Looking in the Sky. And what they would do, they would try to pretend that a lot of these statues were actually animals. Like the Olmec heads, they would try to say that they were jaguars or they were aliens from outer space. The European archaeologists would try to make up anything to say that they were not black. But this one statue called Monkey Looking in the Sky is clearly not a monkey, because first of all, monkeys don't have full lips, and it looks like a person. It is a person. And this just goes to show the depths that these archaeologists will go to deny the African history.
One of the earliest groups that I can find archaeologically would be the Folsom people, F-O-L-S-O-M. That's why you go out, you look at your map, you find various areas that are called the Folsom areas, Folsom, Arizona, Folsom, Nevada. You go out in New Mexico, you find Folsom Prison. And you find one, and one of the biggest archaeological and oldest digs in America is called the Folsom Archaeological Findings out there, where they found all these African artifacts in the ground. And that was 16,000 years ago. 6,000 years ago, Asians began to migrate across the Bering Straits into the United States, and they came into the United States across the Bering Straits into Canada, then down to the northern part of the United States, and down into the southern part, and they interbred and met and interbred with blacks, those Folsom people. And otherwise, that's why American Indians never had slant eyes and were never yellow skinned. They became round-eyed and brown skin and red skin.
All over the country of Costa Rica, you have these little African-like statues just all over the place. And when you go to the museums, you see these African artifacts, African-style gold, a lot of monuments and artifacts that resemble monuments and artifacts from West Africa.
You have one part of the Mississippi River go one way, the other part goes the other way. In the Y of that split, you have a place that Native Americans call Cahokia. Today it's called Collinsville, Illinois. It's near St. Louis. This is where you have the largest pyramid in the Northern Hemisphere. It's called Monk's Mound.
If you look at pictures from the 1900s and beyond, most of the Native American people were very dark-skinned. Sometimes they were very jet black. But most Native American people before 1900, if you look at photos of them, they're extremely dark-skinned people, especially on the West Coast, like in California. The California Indians were very dark-skinned. The Indians that were around the Minnesota and Milwaukee area that we know as Milwaukee and Minnesota now, they were very dark-skinned people. The Native Americans on the East Coast were very dark-skinned people.
In the late 1800s, there was something called the Dawes Rolls, which was basically a census that made records of people's ethnic backgrounds in order to determine which Native American tribes would get certain land allotments and other benefits. After slavery, many black people were associated with some of these tribes by bloodline, through marriage, through adoption, and even servitude. And because they were associated with these tribes, many black people were entitled to some of these benefits. The government did not want blacks to get these benefits, so they created a separate freedmen's list specifically for black people. They also started to list any full-blooded Native American who had African features as black because they didn't want them getting those benefits either. At the same time, they allowed white citizens to come in and pay money under the table to be listed as part Native American.
1895 and 1896, when a lot of the whites found out the benefits that these blacks are going to be entitled to, a lot of whites went to the Dawes Commission and say, look, why don't you put my name on there? They said, but you're not an Indian. So that's what they said, well, I'll give you $5. So then the rule got around, the policy got around that for $5, that a white could put his name on the Dawes rolls and be called himself an Indian and be entitled to all these benefits, and all their children could be entitled to all these benefits forever. And so that became known as what's called a $5 Indian. And so if you go around now and check most of the Indians, the so-called Indians in America, about 90% of them are not even Indians. Those are just whites now who are passing as Indians. But they're getting all the benefits. And they're not paying any taxes, getting free college education. They put up a little reservation on the land that they don't live on. They have another home off and get all kind of benefits.
Iron Eyes Cody was another famous Native American person. He was in the media for years. In the 1970s, they utilized him for this pollution commercial. He was known as the Crying Indian. So he was a very well-known Native American in American culture. But the reality is, Iron Eyes Cody wasn't Native American at all. He was Sicilian. Both of his parents were from Sicily. So he didn't have one drop of Native American blood in him. He was another fake Indian. First authorized paintings from the Americas was of these 3 African men who were the leaders of a maroon colony down in Central America. And these men, the legend is that they were enslaved Africans who escaped, and they were shipwrecked, and they formed a maroon colony down in Central America, and they became leaders of the Native American tribes down in Central America. And this painting of these 3 African men, it's at a museum in Madrid, Spain today.
Boukman, Haitian Revolution, the original revolutionary, because he was turned in the night of the revolution. That's when Toussaint Louverture took over. The book Irritated Genie, we need to read. His name was Boukman. Boukman was called Boukman from Jamaica because he couldn't be handled in Jamaica. He was sold to Haiti. He started a rebellion amongst the African people. And they knew him as Boukman because they always read. He was very intelligent. He always taught the people who they were and what they were. The night before the revolution, Boukman looked to his brothers and sisters in the field and he said, "You want to win? Cast aside your white God. Embrace your African spirit. You are free." He didn't say you will be free. He didn't say you can be free. He didn't say you could be free. He said, cast aside your white God. You are free.
Had it not been for the Haitian Revolution, America would be 50% of its current size, if not more. The Louisiana Purchase doubled America's size, and there would have never been a Louisiana Purchase if there had never been a Boukman Dada, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and Toussaint Louverture, because it was their victory over Napoleon's army that bankrupted the banks of France and forced them to sell its shares of land in America to this country.
Toussaint Louverture gave millions of dollars to a man named Stephen Girard. He was a European sea captain. And Toussaint Louverture gave him this money to get arms because they were going to set up a colony in Africa to fight slavery. And when Toussaint Louverture went to prison, Stephen Girard would not return the money to Toussaint Louverture and his descendants and his family. So Stephen Girard took the money, the millions of dollars that he got from Toussaint Louverture, came to America, started Girard College, and he really became the first American millionaire. And so a lot of people don't know that Girard College was founded on stolen money from Toussaint Louverture. Down in Peru, they found a mummified body of a Peruvian girl who was sacrificed about 500 years ago. And the Peruvian girl, if you look at her, her body's well preserved. She has African features, African facial features. She even has African style braids. And this Peruvian mummified girl is still on display. The HMS Challenger was a ship that went on an expedition in the 1870s. And they went to different places around the world, and one of the places they went to was a place down in South America called Terra del Fuego. It's right on the tip of South America. And they took photographs of some of the Native American people there. And one of the Native Americans down there, one of the Native American pictures they took is a man who looks like a West African man. He's pure Native American though. And this picture of this Native American man who looks like a West African, this photograph is at the London Museum to this day. So this just goes to show many African-looking people were already over here.
Remember, when they attacked Africa, they did not attack Africa physically. They did not attack Africa educationally. They attacked Africa spiritually. Jomo Kenyatta said when the European first came to Africa, the Africans had the land and the white man had the Bible. White man told him to close his eyes, get on his knees and pray. Jomo said when the black man opened his eyes, the white man had the land and the black man had the Bible. We have bought into a story that we told them. They have twisted it. They got it twisted. We have now bought that story back.
What we call the African and the communities that that person lived in is where the concept of religion comes from. Europe never produced a religion, ever. Asia receives its religion from Africa. All of them. Buddhism, Hinduism, Shinto. As a matter of fact, to be more scholarly, starts with Hinduism. The first Hindu gods to come across were black Africans. And they came across, they were called Sambo, which is now a derogatory term used for blacks, mulattoes, etc. Sambo.
I said, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are merely fragments from the periphery of the African spiritual system that you call voodoo. People said, you can't even go there with that. I can go there with that. And I can take on any theologian that you got, bring them down, and I'll show you. Give me your 12 tribes, give me your 12 disciples, give me your 99 pearls of faith of Islam, and I'll show you those are nothing but sets of qualities and attributes, and I can juxtapose them in a perpendicular line besides the Orishas of the Yoruba, besides the Loas of the Voodoo, besides the Netters of Egypt, and show you we're talking about the same system.
Jesus is a name which did not come into existence in the English form until the 1600s. The letter J was not invented until the 1600s. Let me say this again. Now, the letter J was not invented until the 1600s. So the reality is Jesus is not the name of that person. His name is an Amharic name, Yeshua.
1482, Leonardo da Vinci was commissioned to paint a painting of Christ and the 12 disciples. This was 1482, 10 years before Columbus set sail, because that painting would be the greatest weapon used in colonialism, and still is right now, because many black people around the world still have that original Last Supper. And so when Leonardo was asked to paint that picture, he got his uncle to actually sit in, and this is an historic record. He got his uncle to sit in and pose as Christ, and he got 12 criminals from a local jail who happened to be available to sit in as the 12 disciples.
The only reason you call God by that name is because your former enslaver, your former oppressor, taught you that name. He never taught you the real name. He never gave you the keys to the power to free yourself spiritually, so that you are now spiritually or religiously still a slave.
The African population in North America is the third largest black population in the world in any geopolitical state. Why don't we have a single word out of one of our language for God that we use? The Arabs use their word for God. The Jews use their word for God. The Catholics use their word for God. The Japanese use their word for gods. The African is the only population that don't have an African word for God. Yet, studies coming out of Geneva over the last 30 years prove that we are the most spiritual people in the world, not just America. We worship with a greater propensity than any other people in the world, but we don't have a single word in our language for our divine.
The word Christ is a title. It's not a name. Christ means the anointed one. And there were many people before the birth of Jesus who also bore that title, Christ. There were 16 people who were known as Christ. So Jesus was the last of saviors of mankind, saviors of a group of people who were known as Christ.
When you talk about the image of Christ, it is important that we no longer ascribe to the European image of Christ. Why? Because the brain is an associating organism. It stores everything as pictures. And because it is associating, if you force feed an African child that Christ is white, because the brain associates, as that child begins to grow, the brain will associate white Christ with white people. And so if white Jesus is God, then white people must also be the gods of humanity. And so guess what? The power in the painting is transferred to the people who resemble that painting. And so it is difficult to pray to a white Jesus and not in some way feel inferior to white people. And that's why when I talk to Christian ministers, I often tell them you have to change these pictures. They say it don't matter. Of course it matters. Why do you think the European went around the world and systematically altered the image of Christ in every major cathedral, every major church, every corner of the globe? Because it is difficult to oppress a people whose image of the God doesn't look like the oppressor. But when God and the oppressor look one in the same, then the people will come to believe that the oppression was ordained by God.
What we find is that in this story that came out of Kemet, after Set reconstituted the body of her husband Asar, the spirit of Asar came and impregnated his virgin wife, Aset. And then 9 months later, the virgin Aset gave birth to her son, Heru. And Heru was born 4,000 years ago on December the 25th.
So in 325, it was decided that Jesus Christ would be a son of God. In 325, it was decided that Jesus Christ would be born in the manger in Bethlehem. Up until the Nicene Council, most people believe that Jesus Christ was born in a cave in Ethiopia, even in Ethiopia till today.
Christmas was not celebrated in December 25th. For hundreds of years. It was celebrated in August. They moved it to December 25th because that's the Egyptian celebration of the birth of the son of the sun. Talking about Heru and Asar.
The image that we have of Santa Claus is the rosy-cheeked European jolly guy, and that image was created sometime in the early 1800s. But the real Santa Claus was a man by the name of St. Nicholas. And when I do research about St. Nicholas, the real St. Nicholas, the further back I go, the blacker St. Nicholas gets. And when you look at pictures and portraits of St. Nicholas in museums in Europe, St. Nicholas is totally black. And there's a museum in Italy that has an old painting of St. Nicholas, and he has like dark skin, woolly hair. So people have to realize that the Santa Claus that we know and love today is based on a black saint from Europe.
The Council of Nicaea was an effort by Constantine to control the people through military and through religion. Whoever can control your concept of God has a weapon more powerful than any physical weapon, than any sword, any gun, any atomic weapon. Whoever controls how you relate to the unseen presence of God will not only control you, but can control your children and your children's children. So it was at the Council of Nicaea that the Constantine, this emperor, needed to find a way to consolidate his power, because the people that he conquered in various parts of the world had different religions, different ideologies. And it was at Nicaea where he brought together these theologians, these scholars, if you will, to hammer out one uniform theology that everyone would follow.
And if Constantine could convince people to take Jesus as God on earth and change that he was a human being, then they could take over the control of the Catholic Church and make one. So they invited. And one of the priests was an African known as Arius, Bishop Arius. There's a book called Blacks Who Died for Jesus by Mark Hyman. Gives the story of Arius. Arius now gets word that Constantine knows Arius is coming to dispute this. Because he's saying, how are you going to tell people this? Nobody's going to believe that story. That Immaculate Conception? Come on, we know that's written on the walls of Egypt. That's a mythology, that's an analogy. You're not supposed to believe that story. That's a nice story to live by, that each and every one of us has Jesus within us and every birth is an Immaculate Conception. But there was no one boy born as the Son of God to free. Come on, you can't. Constantine said, look, come on over here, Nicaea, I'm gonna talk to you. He found out that he was gonna be assassinated. So he fled into Europe with his followers. Arius and his followers became known as the Aryans. Wouldn't Hitler have a heart attack if he knew who the real Aryans were? They were a bunch of black folk.
Everybody who was worshiping Isis and dealing with mostly a Kemetic religious philosophy, they said, we can't do this. This is ridiculous. This reminds me, there's no man called Jesus Christ. We ain't never heard of him. Well, Jesus Christ will take Jesus, which was the sun god in the West, and we'll take Christos, which was the sun god in the East, and we'll put them together. We'll have a name. And so what did he do? A man named Apollonius of Tyana, at that time, who had studied philosophy in Kemet, was teaching. He was a healer, working miracles. He was a hero at that time. So he became the template for Jesus Christ.
the first slave ship, the first ship that was used to bring Africans from the continent and transport them across the Americas, was known as the good ship Jesus. And as Alex Haley said when he did his research for Roots, he said that traditionally, when Africans were loaded on the slave ships, the captain in his log would see to it that the first two people loaded aboard those slave ships were a man and a woman, and they were recorded in the ship's log as Adam and Eve.
The African priests were always smarter than the European thief. Always remember that. The thief is never smarter than the one he or she is taking from. The one he or she is taking from is a superior being. That's why you're stealing. This is the whole point to why you're taking, because what we got, you ain't got.
And in the case of King James, I believe it was 1604 when he initiated, 1604, 1609, when he commissioned a group of 50 men to pull together all of the references, all of the biblical references in existence. And one of the men who, it is said, participated in this project was the most prolific writer of the English language at that time, a young poet by the name of William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare did work on that project, but as with many religious works that were commissioned during that era, none of the authors were allowed to put their signatures on their works. So artists, being the creative people that they are, found creative ways of putting their signatures. In Psalms 46, verse 3, and Psalms 46, verse 9. The 46th word from the beginning of Psalms 46 is the word shake. The 46th word from the end of Psalms 46, 9 is the word spear, Shakespeare's name. Now, if you look at other versions of the Bible, not the King James Version, but other versions of the Bible, you won't find that same correlation, only in the King James Version.
We are so far removed from the reality of our African spirituality. And until we cast aside that white God, we can't be free.
There's a war of genocide that the ignorance of Europe and Asia is allowing them, for the sake of trying not to be faced with genetic annihilation, has allowed them to concoct ways of murdering us. I mean, we can go to the syphilis experiments at Tuskegee, or we can go to the AIDS in Africa. I mean, look at this thing in Africa. We got AIDS, and so everybody in Africa, all of a sudden, some of the first we saw popped up in New York City in the homosexual community, now it pops up in Africa, and tens of millions of people have got it, and the pharmaceutical company is going crazy selling them drugs that they have to stay on for perpetuity. Billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars, you are guaranteed, because all these Africans have to take this medicine for the rest of their life. Give me a break. You tell me the guy who enslaved me, the guy who practiced colonialism against me, the guy who raped my mama, my sister, cut the testicles off my father, ripped me apart with horses, all of a sudden is gonna come to my well-being and make me a medicine that's good for me, when his whole history is about profit and genocide at any cost, even if it meant killing his mother. And I'm not just talking about our European brothers and sisters as regards dealing with the black brothers and sisters. If you just read books on the Inquisition and the horror and the genocide waged against European working people and the women of Europe is so horrific, it makes even the transatlantic slave trade looks pale sometimes.
The whole AIDS hoax has been about us getting to take the medication. There's no HIV that creates AIDS. They found that the HIV is a very innocuous, very benign so-called virus and doesn't cause anything. What does cause AIDS is drugs, the taking of medications. And what created the AIDS condition in the homosexual community that came what is known as GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency, were these poppers, amyl nitrate and butyl nitrate, these things that were used for the heart to dilate the muscles. Well, the homosexual community, the one who created it into these little popping things, when you broke the seal, it made a pop, so they call them poppers. It was the inhalation of these things that began to bring down the so-called immune system of the homosexuals, and they began to have this immunodeficiency based upon overuse of this. Why did they use these poppers? Because when they used these poppers and they inhaled it, not only did they get the rush, but the anus began to dilate and relax. So the homosexuals were using this left and right. Thousands are being sold here in New York. And when they found that, they did not put in that poppers were the ones, and that drugs and these poisonous medications were creating the conditions called AIDS. They took the opportunity to ride the HIV/AIDS connection because they knew the money that would be made and that they could recruit people into believing that a heinous disease had attacked everybody. And where did it come from? Africa.
It's always wise to study your enemy. If you're going to defeat someone, you must know their strengths and their weaknesses.
People have been utilizing Africans to heal themselves for centuries. And people have been going to African shamans, African witch doctors to find cures for themselves, that Eastern medicine. So people have been going to African people to cure themselves for years.
The doctor that's given credit for a lot of the internal examinations that women go through, those instruments were first tested on women who were enslaved. And I can only imagine, well, I can't even imagine. A woman could imagine, but the kind of pain that that woman was put through to test those particular iron, steel objects that would go up through their bodies.
In the United States, what they would do with slave children, and this has been well documented, to cure rheumatism and to cure gout and to cure arthritis, they would place their feet on top of a slave child and just keep their feet there for hours, thinking that the child, the melanin, would draw out whatever sickness the slave masters would have.
Well, we know that a lot of things have happened in our hospitals. We know that experiments was used on our people in almost every city hospital in America.
Henrietta Lacks was a sister who lived in Baltimore and who had cervical cancer, and ultimately died of cervical cancer. And the doctors harvested some of her cells, and what they discovered in performing tests on her cells were that her cells were immune to specific diseases, specific cancers. So there was a quality in her cells that was resistant to disease. And they began to develop a host of vaccines and treatment modalities using the cells of this black woman, and they never told her family that they had harvested her cells, that they had made millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars.
Henrietta Lacks' own DNA and her cells are all over the world right now because they were so prolific, they just kept on multiplying. That was an indication of the fact that as African peoples, we hold the genetics for eternal youth.
There's a book called Acres of Skin that talks about the experiments that was done on black men in Philadelphia prisons from the 1950s to the 1970s.
In addition to the many medical experiments that are done on blacks in hospitals and prisons around the country, many people believe that chemtrails that are often seen over black communities purposely contain chemicals that create adverse reactions within the black community.
The chemtrails are dangerous because of what they contain: barium, strontium, and genetically altered red blood cells. What are genetically altered red blood cells doing in an aerosol?
If you go to Harvard, They have a place on the campus, one of the tallest buildings on Harvard University. It's called the Herbarium. The Herbarium. In there, every floor is dedicated to some parts of Africa and Asia, and mostly Africa, where the young scholars who are working on their PhD is sent to study the fauna and the herbs and the plants of these places, and to interview the so-called healers and witch doctors, and come back to Harvard and tell what medicine, what medicinal purposes these herbs, fauna, and plants are used for, and then they create synthetic versions of it and sell that formula to the pharmaceutical companies.
There's a drug epidemic in a neighborhood, and the hospital is quiet. Forget law enforcement for a minute. The hospital, this is the center of the community's health, and the hospital is quiet. So we're in a situation where the institutions by which we live are conspiring against us. There's no such thing as an institution that is standing with its lights on and people going in and out of the institution, and you're still not receiving the service of the institution. How is that possible, that there is a standing hospital in most neighborhoods and everyone's sick? How is it possible that there is a police department in every neighborhood, several, and crime is still what it is? How is it possible that there is a public school and people are dumber? I argue conspiracy.
The black community is really the only community that's really afraid of hospitals. If you go around the country and talk to different African-American people, they have horror stories about certain hospitals within the neighborhoods. Out here in Los Angeles, you have a hospital called King Drew Medical Center. Well, it was closed down, but they had a hospital called the King Drew Medical Center. And if you ask any black person in Los Angeles, they say, well, that's Killer King Hospital. It was known for people going in there for minor ailments and not coming out. And there were all types of rumors about King Drew Medical Center. Some people said they were selling organs, they were killing black people, selling off their body parts. There was a story in the LA Times talking about how people were so afraid to go to the King Drew Medical Center that if they got injured, they would run from the ambulance if they knew the ambulance was going to take them to the King Drew Medical Center. So that type of reputation has been going on in the black community for years about certain hospitals in the area.
It is very difficult to use black people to experiment and find out cures because of melanin. That's why, experimentally, doctors and Europeans use white mice. They use albinoid mice because the outcome after you go into a white mouse is what's going to happen to a white person. If you use brown and black mice, the outcome is not going to be for white people because a black and brown mice is a melanated mouse. A white mouse is an albinoid. That's why they got pink eyes.
Melanin is an alkaloid. The chemical structure of melanin is an alkaloid, and it is similar to the chemical structure of other alkaloids, which are heroin, cocaine, and marijuana. And the other important aspect of this is because of the fact that melanin is an alkaloid, it binds to other alkaloids. So black folk who smoke crack or do cocaine, heroin, or marijuana are inclined to get higher faster and have a more intense high because of the alkaloid in the melanin binds to the alkaloid in that drug, which consequently means that people of African ancestry are going to become addicted faster and have a more difficult time trying to kick those drugs.
It wasn't just crack cocaine that came into the black and Latino areas. It was a way of life that came into the areas that replaced another way of life. Let me go back a little bit. Just before the crack cocaine way of life, you had the cocaine way of life. You know, not to call any names, but the pinnacle is Studio 54, where you know, this 70s New York City nightlife, where cocaine is everywhere and flagrant. In rap music, in early MC and DJing, you get MCs on the mic saying cocaine, cocaine. Somebody say blow, blow. That, all of that kind of stuff. Early parties. Before that, I'm talking just now 77, 76. Before that, go back 75, 74, 73. Heroin was the lifestyle that was pushed onto the Black and Latino community. Each one of these destructive lifestyles were introduced into the community.
The youth in the country in the 60s almost brought us to the democracy we say we are. And the tyranny that rules our country by controlling the economy of this country decide to bring drugs and then use the war on drugs to create laws like the 3 strikes and you out and the Rockefeller laws that are as worse as any we saw in the Soviet Union during the Stalinist period, to put the young people in prison, many of them for the rest of their lives, for crimes that normally you would have walked after a year or 2.
The 13th Amendment reads, slavery is abolished except when you are found guilty of a crime and go to jail. So prison is the slave plantation. And look at all the things that are denied you in jail is the same thing that were denied Africans on the plantation. Slavery still is very much alive.
Today, there are more African American adults under correctional control in prison or jail on probation or parole than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. Crime and crime rates did not drive mass incarceration to begin with. Incarceration rates have fluctuated over the years, gone up, gone down. Today, are actually at historical lows, but incarceration rates, especially Black incarceration rates, have consistently soared regardless of whether crime was going up or going down in any given community or the nation as a whole. War on drugs, which has been a major engine of mass incarceration, has targeted poor communities of color, especially Black and brown men, even though studies have consistently shown now for decades that people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than white.
Before 1964, the prison rate in America, the majority of people in prison were white people, were white guys. But the thing is, there was no need to have a strong police presence in the Black community because Black people were already controlled by the basic laws of the land. Black people were already controlled by Jim Crow laws, signs saying Black people drink from this water fountain, Black people couldn't live in this neighborhood. So Black people were just controlled, period, at that time. Now, after the Civil Rights Bill passed in 1964, this is when the police presence became very strong in the Black community, because the average citizen couldn't control Black people like they could before then. So they came up with another strategy and had law enforcement do it. So around 1964, 65, Black communities were flooded with law enforcement. And this is why the Black Panthers was started, because of the police brutality that had started in the Black community.
Prisoners themselves represent a small percentage of the population under correctional control. Like today, there's about 7.6 million people under correctional control, but only about 1.3 million are in prison of that. The rest are on probation, parole, in jail, overwhelmingly for minor nonviolent offenses and drug offenses. The problem is that even if you don't get prison time, even if you're lucky enough to get just felony probation, you're saddled for the rest of your life with a felony record. And so the question isn't, in my view, just who's in prison. The question is, who is branded a criminal or felon and must live with that label for the rest of their lives?
The people said, well, if we don't need Black labor anymore, what do we do with it? Well, we have to set up a system in the commercial system, or at least incorporate black people into the commercial system so that they make us money without having to do the labor of picking cotton or picking sugar cane or whatever. We're already past that. So how do we make a more sophisticated plantation where we can keep slaves? Well, let's criminalize pretty much every damn thing that we do. There are over 1 million laws on the books now. Who needs 1 million laws? Unless you want to control people's behavior.
The police presence has always been in the black community because we are prisoners of war. That's number one. The original police were created to catch slaves. They were slave catchers. There was no need to police a white society. There was no need for that in early America. There was no need for that. Police even became wild when, police were always about guarding property. That's what the police are about, guarding property. That's it. Their job gets stretched out to a moral responsibility and public safety and that kind of thing later on in their development. But the original concept of a police officer is to make sure your property stays with you. They are hired by the rich, first of all, to protect the rich's property.
People of all races who are jobless, especially chronically jobless, are more likely to be violent than those who are not. And ghettoized communities are areas of concentrated poverty and joblessness. So it's not a surprise that there are higher rates of violent crime. And this idea that there's something especially wrong with black men that makes them more likely to be violent, or especially wrong with black culture that leads to high rates of violence, is just disproved by all of the available evidence. If we were to invest in education and job creation in the communities that needed it most and eradicate these high levels of joblessness, we would also see the racial disparity in violent crime disappear.
A lot of people don't know the original street gangs in America were European immigrants, and the movie Gangs of New York goes into that, how these Europeans came over and they formed the first street gangs in America. And the thing is, they weren't demonized.
There was a wave of white crime, where white immigrants coming to the United States who were jobless and poor were engaging in high rates of crime. But the response wasn't, let's lock them all up and throw away the key. The response was, what can we do to save our young men? And they went in and invested in education and job creation and providing social services and a safety net to ensure that these young men did not slip through the cracks, and viewed them as one of us who need to be protected and saved, whereas young black men in ghettoized communities are viewed today as largely disposable.
80% of prisons are found in Republican districts, because you may have a town of, let's say, 20,000 people. Let's say you have 20,000 prisoners in the prison in your community. When it's time to be taxed, when it's time to get money from the government, you have 40,000 people. And even though those other 20,000 never get money that are in prison, they're accounted for in your population.
There's extraordinary amount of money being made off of mass incarceration today. I mean, part of it is private prisons, which are making their money, from caging human beings quite directly, but there's also a range of other private corporate interests that are profiting from the prison industry today. Private phone companies that charge prisoners and their families exorbitant rates just to place phone calls and remain in touch with loved ones. Taser gun manufacturers, private health care providers that provide typically abysmal health care to people behind bars, have secured very lucrative contracts, and then, there's private corporations that are now using prison labor, rather than shipping jobs overseas, are actually using prison labor, paying them far less than minimum wage.
Many of these furnitures we see in all the state offices and stuff, they're made by brothers and sisters in prison. They try to make it seem like it's just license plate. It's a lot more than that. Then all of them are located in areas where there are farms. And almost all of them are loaned out to work these farms, where they're getting only pennies a day. Slavery.
Many of these agencies get rewarded in cash by the millions for the sheer numbers of people swept in for drug offenses, which helps to explain why so many law enforcement agencies go out looking for the so-called low-hanging fruit, stopping, frisking, searching as many people as possible in the hopes of boosting their numbers up and continuing to qualify for funding.
Anytime you can put your prison on the stock market, it means you already have a methodology to guarantee the commodity, and the commodity is the imprisoned young black man and woman.
You're given a number, and you're warehoused in this cell, and you become a warehouse receipt. So more jails are kept up because the warehouse receipts, and if you don't have anybody in jail, you're not making any money. So you need to keep the jails filled in order for those warehouse receipts to be traded on Wall Street and the insurance companies to be making money each time.
Drug markets, much like American society generally, are fairly segregated by race. Black folks typically sell to black folks, Latinos to each other. Drug markets even segregated by class. You know, university students sell to each other. You know, drug dealing happens in every community of all colors, but those who do time for drug crime are overwhelmingly black and brown. President Richard Nixon was the first to coin the term a war on drugs, but it was President Ronald Reagan, really, who turned that rhetorical war into a literal one. And he declared his drug war in 1982, actually a couple of years before crack first began to ravage inner city communities and become a media sensation. The media frenzy around crack cocaine didn't just happen, it was actually part of, you know, a political campaign conducted by the Reagan administration to sensationalize crack use in inner city communities to boost public support for a drug war they had already declared and persuade Congress to devote millions more dollars to waging it. After crack became a media sensation, harsh mandatory minimum sentences started sailing through Congress, you know, harsh mandatory minimum sentences for minor drug offenses, sentences larger than murderers receive in many other Western democracies. And soon Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove they could be even tougher on them, those people, than their Republican counterparts. And so it was President Bill Clinton who actually escalated the drug war far beyond what Reagan and his Republican predecessors even dreamed possible.
There was a representative in Missouri named Chuck Graham, and he had a proposal. He had something called the Life for Life program. And with this program, they wanted to offer prisoners on death row lighter sentences if they were to donate one of their organs or body parts.
Well, the war on drugs was part of a grand Republican Party strategy known as the Southern Strategy of using racially coded get tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare to appeal to poor and working class whites, particularly in the South, who were anxious about or resentful of many of the gains of African Americans in the civil rights movement. And President Richard Nixon's former chief of staff, Haldeman, described the strategy this way, and I believe I'm recalling the quote correctly. He said, quote, "The whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to," end quote. The meth epidemic has been severe, and you know, some have argued that the meth epidemic is actually far worse than what the crack epidemic was in terms of the harm that it caused. But you know, there hasn't been any media frenzy associated with the meth epidemic. There has been an increase in the number of whites going to prison for drug offenses since the meth epidemic, but there hasn't been an all-out war waged against you know, people who are predominantly white, who use and sell meth. It doesn't matter how severe the racial disparities are, unless you have can offer proof of conscious intentional bias tantamount to an admission of racial bias by a law enforcement official. You can't even state a claim for racial bias in the criminal justice system today, which presents a bit of a challenge since most law enforcement officials, like the rest of us, know better than to state our racial biases out loud. A police officer isn't gonna say, "Yes, Your Honor, the reason I stopped him was, well, because he was black."
People look at it as a civil rights violation, but it's really a human rights violation, because it's criminal what they're doing to black people on a mass scale, criminalizing the image of black people and railroading them into a jail system really for profit. That's slavery, and that's a human rights issue, and black people need to start treating that as a human rights issue. So we shouldn't go to the courts here, because the courts here are in cahoots with the private organizations that's railroading all of these black men into the prison system. So if black people are going to do anything, they need to take this fight to the world court, to the world stage.
Well, I do think mass incarceration is a human rights issue, a human rights crisis. And there have been efforts to bring these issues to the United Nations and to international courts. And I think we should continue to do so. I do think we should avail ourselves of those tribunals and make more of an effort to educate people in other countries about the realities of what is going on in the United States. So many people around the world today think that the U.S. is the land of great racial equality, especially with the election of Barack Obama, and it's important for the other story to be told.
At the time, we had just come back from Vietnam, and there was a threat. King David and King Alfred plan because of the blacks, and remember, it was mostly blacks that were fighting in the end in Vietnam. And they feared, at least this is my conjecture, they feared that these soldiers who were coming back home with the knowledge of warfare and all the tactics that they learned about the Europeans and warfare were to be used on them. The King Alfred plan was to make sure that they would round up people into concentration camps the way they did with the Japanese, the internment camps, as well as to shut down areas, grids of electricity in the areas where blacks were consolidated. Also to place bombs, most people don't know, to place impediments or areas, or to set up roadblocks, or to cordon off whole communities.
Freeway systems in black areas are designed to really regulate the community. For example, out here in Los Angeles, South Central LA is really surrounded by 4 freeways. It's surrounded by the 10 freeway, the 110, the 405 freeway, and the 105 freeway. During the LA riots in 1992, a lot of people don't know that they actually shut the freeways down, and they were going to start bringing in the National Guard, where they actually did bring in the National Guard. So the black community, they always have freeway systems there because they never know when they need to implement that King Alfred plan, when they need to go in there with military tanks, if there's some racial insurrection, and really suppress the black community. So that's one of the reasons for the freeway systems being directly on top of the black communities around the country.
And every black community in America got expressways that went right through them, destroyed them. If you want to find out where the old black communities used to be, go in the city and find the expressways. There's a direct relationship between having the businesses and being in prison. Go find see how many Asians you can find in American prisons. You ain't gonna be in there. But 51% of your prison will be black because blacks don't have any businesses and industries. There's a direct link. Blacks won't practice group economics. Blacks won't practice group politics. If you don't practice, you're setting yourselves up. I told that 5-story building, you're setting yourself to get wiped out. Understand the nature of race, which is economics. If you build the first floor, it's economic. Build your businesses and your industries. Control business and industry, and put that pools in your money, and hold that money, and practice group economics with it. Arab and Asian money bounces 12 to 13 times what it leaves. Jewish money bounces 18 times. Black folk gotta learn how to practice group economics. Black Americans spend every penny they get outside their own community. Then you take the money and the wealth that you get from that first floor and go to the second floor. The second floor is politics. You then take that money on the first floor and you control your politics. Black folk must quit allowing people to tell them to go out and vote. Vote for what? Nobody's gonna do anything for black folk in politics. Politics is controlled by money, major corporations who got the money. That's what controls politics. If you have no money, you have no say-so, you have no benefits coming. So you take your money and you control, and you take your money from the first floor, you buy every politician on the second floor. And then the politician you can't buy, you rent or lease them to get what you need. Then once you get the second floor under control with your politician, with your money, then you go to the third floor. The third floor then is the police department and the court systems. You take your money from the first floor and your politics on the second floor, and you control the court system and the police departments. Then the fourth floor, then is media. You then take the money that you generate off the first floor from business and industries, and you go after radio stations, TV stations, newspapers, and cable systems, so that you can now inform and communicate with your own people. Right now, black folk own and control less than 35 thousandths of 1% of the media in the United States. Out of 12,000 radio stations, black folk own about something like about 75, 80. That's all. You own no cable systems. You don't have a daily newspaper. You have nothing of importance. You got about one black TV station. And so you can't communicate with your people, you can't inform your people, you can't do anything. You can have Rush Limbaugh and all the rest of the guys talking about racism all day long and bad-mouthing you, and O'Reilly's. They can call black folk all kind of names all day long. What are you gonna do? You can't respond. You can't even communicate with your own people because you don't have an economic base. 51% of all the prisoners in the United States are black people. Even though you only make up 12% of the population. That's no accident. It's because you don't control the economics and the politics. And they're gonna go after the weakest people they can get their hands on to incarcerate them. That's the black folk. And what are you gonna do in response to it when they over-incarcerate you? You're gonna go out and have a march, a demonstration. We're gonna march. March for what? Who cares? Marching, they never changed anything.
The prison industrial complex is not gonna work, because you cannot put people in prison that way naturally. It'll last a while. Have your fun. But within 100 years, that's not going to exist. I believe white supremacy was born to die, and everything it does in its ignorant arrogance kills itself. It's meant to die. And what they're doing is they're setting up their own suicide by doing that to other human beings. Some of the most gifted human beings I've met were in prison. Some of the most gifted human beings I've ever met have been in special education. And to think that those young people, male and female, could be educated to cure cancer, to go into outer space, to build things that our community needs, but you'd rather put them in prison because of the color of their skin, what goes around comes around. You shall reap what you sow.
The best way to control melanated people is keeping them poor and disenfranchised, and this is what has happened to black people in America. There's a reason why black people have been economically undermined, because it's very easy to control poor people. When people are poor, you can do whatever you want to them, and they won't have the economic power to fight back. They won't have the economic power to put a politician into power to help them out. They won't have the economic base to really take care of their basic needs, so then you can control them any way you want to.
See, white folk lend us money. They don't pay us, because they know that they're gonna get it right back.
1866. And up to about into the 1920s, black folk had the greatest economic achievement they've ever had in this country. Even though it didn't occur under integration, it occurred under segregation. Those black folk had managed to acquire over 20 million acres of land, according to the United States Census in 1920. 20 million acres of land. But between 1920s and 1950s, they lost almost all of it. Back in the 1920s and up to the 1940s, we had black broom factories, we had black mattress factories. Almost every black major city had at least 2 cab companies. We had black bus companies, we had black shipyard up here in Baltimore. When I say black bus lines, I'm not talking about just having 3 or 4 buses. We had over 500 buses. And this is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And our bus company didn't just service just the black neighborhoods, it serviced the blacks and the white neighborhoods. We had 2 black cab companies. We had the Harris Cab Companies and the Campbell City Cab Companies. But they used to have their own restaurants. They had the best nightclubs in the country. The blacks had 2 baseball leagues. Each baseball league had 8 teams. We had over 500 of the best baseball players in the world. But what did they do? They wanted to integrate. So as soon as they put Jackie Robinson on the Brooklyn Dodgers, black folks said, we'll give up all of our black baseball leagues, black teams, and all our black players, and we can just get one black boy to play on a white team.
Black Americans were gung-ho about integration because we thought that would be our passport to freedom. We equated integration with freedom.
That scared whites to death. And see, at that time you had whites, a lot of these white separate communities. You had white Polish communities, you had white Jewish communities, you had white Italian communities, you had white Irish communities. And white folks said, well, if these blacks are gonna integrate, we're gonna come together and organize as a unit. And so white folk then dropped all their little communities and said, no, we're gonna organize as a one white bloc. We're not gonna talk about I'm being Polish and you're Irish and German anymore. We ain't gonna do that anymore. We're gonna stick together as a group. We're not gonna let all these blacks come and penetrate us.
Because we were doing things and becoming self-sufficient, that became a threat. So instead of them just coming out and attacking, because they couldn't just come out with an all-out attack, we were a little bit too strong for that, and we would have fought back, and there would have been a civil unrest that would have definitely undermined the security of the country. Instead, they said, well, let's invite them into a place that they've always coveted, and that is into the white estuaries of power, into the white citadels of power. Let us make sure we bring them in and incorporate them to us, and therefore, being that they're going to have to buy their facilities and all their materials from us, they're going to have to interface with us anyway, they're going to dress like us, act like us, and we will take the best of what they have and capitalize eventually and take it over. We will have quelled or stopped any threat or competition to our business, and that's exactly what they did.
So black folks stripped themselves of all their resources, they stripped themselves of their unity, they stripped themselves of the role model when all blacks used to live together. Then they had their own role models. All the doctors and lawyers and teachers with the black lived all together. You had a sense of community. You knew each other, you trusted each other, you worked with each other, you participated with each other. You learned how to buy from each other, to sell each other, to support each other, to care about each other, to love each other. Where black folk up into integration, blacks never locked their homes.
We practice a very profound humanity. If an Asian opens a store in our community, we do not boycott and discriminate against them. If an Arab opens a store in our community, we do not boycott and discriminate against them. If a Jewish person opens a store in our community, we do not boycott and discriminate against them. We shop with all peoples. We treat all peoples equally. The problem is they're not treating us equally. See, we caught in our own humanity. And until we begin to address that and demand that others practice towards us the same human concern and love that we practice towards them, we will stay in this situation.
Durham, North Carolina was the most progressive and best black Wall Street we had in America. That's why you had all the black major insurance companies, mortgage companies, and banks and all was in Durham, North Carolina. Durham, North Carolina was the black Wall Street.
Tulsa race riot, and it wasn't really a race riot because the people who rioted were the whites, not the Africans. The Africans defended their territory, they defended their stores and their businesses and their families, but they were destroyed by the whites who were envious of the economic power base that they had developed. And so you'll find that the disturbance ended when the sheriff of Tulsa commandeered a plane and had the pilot fly over the black community and drop sticks of dynamite. So Tulsa became the first city in the world that was bombed from the air.
It was also a way to destroy the ability for a black competition, because essentially the world knew what was happening in the United States to black people, and they were going to give deference to black businesses, in Europe even, because France was ready to do business with Tulsa, Oklahoma. England was ready to do business with Tulsa, Oklahoma, except there are certain parts in Parliament that did not want that. Canada was ready to do business. South America was ready to do business with South. All of Africa, we were ready to essentially undermine what those cotton plantations had built up in the form of commerce for the United States. And they had to make sure that that was destroyed.
There was a group from Tulsa, an R&B group from Tulsa, the Gap Band. Had a song called You Dropped the Bomb on Me, Baby. It's about the Tulsa riot. Gap Band, GAP. GAP are the initials for the streets Greenwood, Archer, and Pine, which was the hub of Black Tulsa Business District.
They have this whole thing that black people get handouts, that black people are dependent on the government. Black people, if we're going to be very honest, black people have never got anything specifically from our government at the exclusion of another group. Never. Black people have never got any kind of welfare benefits at the exclusion of another group. Black people have never gotten affirmative action at the exclusion of another group. Affirmative action benefits white women more than anybody.
Slavery was affirmative action. Slavery was affirmative action. Jim Crow segregation was affirmative action. It was rewarding those people who had certain kind of skin complexion. That's what it was for. Affirmative action was written to be corrective action. C-O-R-R-E-C-T-I-V-E, corrective. Corrective action for what? For something that the government has consistently done to impede, to exploit, to degrade, and to degenerate a specific group of people. That's what it was written for. It had nothing to do with gender, handicap, senior citizens, gays, midgets, humpbacks, just black people. That's the only people the government had systematically at all levels, from the state, county, and federal level, had gone out of their way to pass laws, slave codes, and see, blacks couldn't get out of slavery because of the federal government.
The average black business can't even get the capital to present itself to the black population that the other people can get the capital to do. Now, one would ask the question, how can all these poor immigrants come to this country and have all this capital? If they had that capital, why did they leave home? And if they didn't have the capital when they left home, how are they getting this capital here when they have no credit records and they have no paper trail and they have not? So who's capitalizing them? And I think if we begin to look at that question, we begin to get to the bottom of what's going on in the black community.
See, and you cannot, it's impossible in theory and practice to acquire wealth and power or to be economically competitive without a community. And right now in America, black folk do not have not one single solitary community in America. You cannot prosper, you cannot compete. It's gonna be very difficult for black folk even to survive under the present circumstances because they don't have communities. All black folk got are neighborhoods. A neighborhood is like a bucket with a hole in it. A neighborhood is where you eat and sleep. A community is where you store your values, your history, your wealth, your power, your resources, your jobs, your tax base. Most of these neighborhoods have gotten so bad and so crime-ridden and run down and so dysfunctional that the neighbor has moved and all you got left is a hood. There's nothing left in them. We have a ranking order of acceptability in our society based on skin color, going white, yellow, brown, black. It's in a descending color order, going from the whitest to the darkest. And the wealth is also distributed along the same lines. The whitest at the top got the wealth, power, and resources going down. It trickles down, all the way down. The power and resources go, as they go up and down. The further you go away from the white, the thinner it becomes, the weaker it becomes. And black folk are not that silly. They can say, consequently, if I want something, I'm gonna try to identify with anything as close to white as possible. And that's why you come up with this saying all the time about white ice is colder than black ice. They want to identify with it. But they never understand that rather than identify with it, why don't you go acquire your own? Then your black ice will be just as cold as white ice. Black folk on an aggregated national disposable basis of collected income, they might be the ninth richest nation on earth. Right now, if I take all the black folks' money annually and aggregate it, they might be they're richer than maybe Sweden, Canada, India, Pakistan, whole bunch of countries, Thailand, folks most all put together. But the difference is, what I keep trying to tell blacks, it doesn't make any difference. because it's not aggregated. When you aggregate something, you strengthen exponentially the power of it by multiplying the multiplying factor, by putting them together and then piling it up, making it stronger. But unfortunately, we are the only people that don't want that to occur. Because, you know why? Because traditionally, whites saw black folk aggregate as being a negative. And we see everything through the eyes of whites. Typically, anytime anything that exceeds more than 6% of something that's black, that whites are in charge of it, and you get more than 6%, that sets off an alarm in the white society. If I move into a neighborhood and I'm the only black, whites will accept the one black or the two blacks. But the minute you start getting up further than that, they go on alert. So by the time you hit 6, you know what happened then? They started putting their houses up for sale. If I go in an organization, I got one black in that organization, it's all white organization, they'll accept the one black or two blacks. But the more blacks you come in trying to integrate, that becomes a threat to the dominant society. And they'll either move out of that organization, move out of that neighborhood, or even go to school and take their kids out of school. And where are they gonna move? They're not gonna move to a more integrated society, they're gonna move back with their own people. When a white person takes his kid out of a school, out of an integrated school, he's not gonna go and try to find another integrated school. He's gonna take his kid to a segregated academy, a charter school, or an all-white suburb.
If you went back to, the 1500s, slavery's in full effect, okay? And you go to a slave or an African and you say right there, while he's picking the cotton, right there, yo, man, what you think about this whole situation you in right now? You're gonna get 2 types of people. You're gonna get 3. You're gonna get one type of person say, what situation? I'm just picking cotton. Then you're gonna get another person that says, well, it's kind of, Master Charlie kind of hard on me, but he all right. Then you get this other person that's like, yo, what's your name? You got something called a MAP? I'm trying to get out of here. These are the 3 people you're gonna meet on the plantation. In the 1500s, these are the 3 people you're gonna meet. I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't care that I'm here, and I'm trying to get the hell out of here. Come now, 2012. Ask a person in any job situation where they go, you're gonna be 3 types of people. 1, why do you work for FedEx? What do you mean, why I work for FedEx? I got a job. Why do you work for FedEx? Well, it is hard hours, man. It's long. I was driving this truck. It's crazy, but it's the best I can do right now, and I get a good check. Last person, why do you work at FedEx? I don't work here. I'm really an MC. I'm waiting for my opportunity to record my album. I'm only doing this right now so I can eat. Yo, really? My name is da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I'm trying to get free.
The colors have been hidden. They're not lost. They're hidden. Lost you may never find. Hidden you just gotta look for.
Know your purpose. You have a purpose. Everything alive in nature, even inanimate objects, have purpose. You have a purpose. Know your purpose. If you don't know your purpose, link up with someone who knows their purpose. Chances are when you link up with someone who knows their purpose, you find yours.
A major solution to countering the war on melanated people is to read, to do what was illegal for your ancestors to do during the period of enslavement. It's no accident that laws were passed preventing African people from reading or writing. If you can't tell where you came from, you can't pass on that knowledge to your descendants.
There are many retired teachers, old school teachers in the 60s and 70s that remember the old system of teaching. Remember how it was ABCs first, your dynamics of mathematics, what it is. Those old school teachers are sitting there with nothing to do. They're just getting a pension and they're rotting away. Get together in your community. Get a home, rent a building or whatever, and use her, who has the credentials of a teacher, and the homeschooling credentials together, and teach your own children. Create your own curriculum. Teach them, of course, to keep up in the outer world as far as competition is concerned and what to do, but teach your own children, because the psychological dynamic of your own being taught by you is enormous, has ramifications way down the line when they go out into the other world.
Travel is very important in terms of real education. To be somewhere in that instance, to actually go somewhere and be in that place, definitely sheds a lot of knowledge on things that are hidden in one society and is beaming like sunlight in another one.
What I've learned in traveling to Africa, specifically in South Africa, I had assumed as I got involved in the African-centered movement in the late 80s and learning all of these wonderful stories about ancient African history and culture, I assumed the continental Africans knew that history. But when I went to South Africa and started talking about Kemet, they had no idea. And why was that? Because they were socialized.
We hear about the Asian scramble for Africa. We hear about the East Indian scramble, the European scramble for Africa. There should be an African-American scramble for Africa. We should be going into Africa with our finances organized and saying, guess what? We're going to invest in this oil. Here's $5 million up front, okay? Show us a budget on paper. What do you need for the refineries? Okay, what are they going to cost? Where are you going to purchase them from? We're going to invest in that. We're going to invest in the diamonds. Enough of De Beers and Oppenheimer, okay? We're going to sell our own diamonds. Isn't it amazing that 90% of the world's diamonds comes out of the ground of Africa, and there's not a black man on earth who sells diamonds anywhere?
Ghanaian chiefs came together in ceremonies with African Americans. I was there, I saw it with my own eyes. And they apologized for their ancestors selling us into enslavement. They apologized and they opened the door for African Americans to come back to Ghana. And the Ghanaian government passed legislation giving land and citizenship to any African American who wanted to come back to Ghana. And hundreds, if not thousands, have taken them up on that offer.
During the administration of Jimmy Carter, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a white paper that was sent to all State Department agencies that everything in their power had to be done to keep African Americans and Africans from uniting politically, culturally, or economically.
Sisters and brothers on the continent are told, don't mess with those African Americans. They do drugs, they're violence, they don't respect themselves, they don't respect their women. And I've been told by people who come here as students and what have you, that their parents are warned. Tell their children, don't mess around with those African Americans. Bad things will happen to you. So there's a deliberate lack of connectedness. And I think that the powers that be understand the potential of the link up between Africans in the diaspora and Africans at home.
I deal a lot with African brothers and sisters who come here all the time. Some of them who have temporary visas, school visas, working visas, and some who have actually become citizens. And I know for a fact that when they come here and come through customs, they are given an orientation into living in America. And one of the things that they are specifically told to do is stay away from African Americans. They're not good people to hang around. In fact, I've even heard that there is a video shown, a propaganda video that is shown to African immigrants, kind of highlighting some of the negative things that African Americans participate in and how they should stay away from us. So without a doubt, that threat of a Pan-African unification is something that, the global powers of the world is very concerned about, especially with the intermingling of black folk from all over the world. And that's why when you come across a lot of Africans, they're afraid to interact with you because they've been told by the government that allowed them to be here in the first place that we don't want to see you around them. And that's why you tend not to see their participation in our political organizations, because many of them are not citizens, so they can be deported at a second's notice. And as we know, because of racism, an African is more likely to be deported than anybody else for subversive activity. That doesn't mean we can't work with them.
How do you fix it? You have to govern yourself. Nation building begins with governing your family. Black men, stay home. You don't have to be at the bar every week. You ain't gotta be out with the buddies. Tend to your wife and your children. Make them the priority in your life and govern your family. Link with other men that are governing their families. Too many times, black men that are good with their families link up with other black men that corrupt them and destroy the family. The only way a nation can be built is if the family is intact. A nation is a bunch of united families. That's what a nation is.
Once you build those things, learn how to start practicing group economics. Group economics means that every nickel, every dollar, penny comes in your hands, make sure it revolves around and goes to other black folks' hands at least 8 to 12 times before it leaves. That means if you got a black community, a dollar comes in, you go down to the black grocery store and buy your black groceries. The black grocery store owner, he goes over to the black barber and gets his hair cut from a black barber. The black barber then goes down and buys his car from a black automobile dealership. The black automobile dealership then goes ride in a black cab. And you understand what I'm saying?
The black community doesn't need any new leaders. Black people just have to get on the same page with one another and black people will be all right. The thing is, there's no gay leader. The gay community just happens to be on the same page with one another and they know how to get their needs met. There's no Jewish leader. There's no white leader. White people, Jewish people, all of these groups, they just happen to be on the same page and this is where their strength comes from and they know how to get their needs met. The thing is, black people, we're too divisive among each other. So we have to get on the same page and that will alleviate many of our problems right there.
Go back to all those black and white films where you saw the Klan marching on Washington. Thousands of white men in hooded robes marching. Where are all those robes today? So they burned them all. This is what baffles me about American society. Who cleans these robes? These robes are not machine washable. They got patches and stuff on them. You got to take it to the cleaners. Who's upgrading and mending, sewing, and keeping all those robes in material existence to this day? Who's doing that work? Who's doing it? Where the robes go? Why you can't get one on auction? Why you don't see one at the Salvation Army? Thrift shop, Klan robe at the thrift shop. Somebody turned it in. Why you don't see that? Because people are still holding on to them. They even still wearing them. Maybe not outside, but somewhere it's still getting worn. Now I could tell you where all the Black Panther outfits are. They got holes in them with red liquid all over them. I can tell you where the guns went. The cops took them after they shot this guy in the, come on. Fred Hampton, I can tell you where his guns went. We know what happened to our movements. What happened to the other one?
I would say that what you do for yourself depends on what you think of yourself. And what you think of yourself depends on what you know of yourself. And what you know of yourself depends on what you have been told. Never allow anybody to tell you that history and culture is not important. Never let anybody say that happened a long time ago, get over it. Make your history sacred. Malcolm X used to say, of all our studies, it is history that is most qualified to reward our research. Believe that what you do makes a difference in the world, that we do not have to be passive victims, that you can blame other people for your victimization, but for your rehabilitation, your salvation, your liberation, that's your responsibility.
We're supposed to be controlling like black hair. We're the only people got a certain texture of hair, thickness in hair. It calls curly or kinky, whatever you want to call it. Why is it the Koreans are controlling black hair care? At 85 cents out of every dollar goes to Asians and Koreans. Why are Koreans and Chinese controlling black hair care and black hair care products? Because you're not practicing group economics. I go to a Chinese place and I ask them to buy something from black folk. They won't do it. Some black distributors came right here to Washington, D.C., to H Street right over here, and said, we'd like to meet with some merchants, sell you some products. And the agent said, what do you want to sell? He said, we'll sell you some of the same products you got on your shelf right now. we'll sell it to you and give you a 25 to 30% discount. The agent said, we're not interested. The agent said, but with a 25, 30% discount, you're still not interested? They said, no. They said, why not? Agent said, you black folk don't understand. It ain't the money. It's that we only buy from our own people. You blacks are the only people that buy from any and everybody.
School books, textbooks. We need to put pressure on the schools so that this information is brought in. Put pressure on the pastor so that you have a Sunday school class that teaches about the black presence in the Bible. All kinds of basic things that we can do. I don't think it's rocket science. I think it's just a matter of us sitting down and strategizing and then implementing those strategies.
The thing is, you can alter nature temporarily. If you tame an animal, you can tame a wild animal to do circus tricks, but after a while, that animal is going to turn on you and go back to its original nature. You can travel around the world and you see societies that are engulfed in trees, vines. Nature has engulfed certain vast civilizations. Certain civilizations are covered in sand. Nature has taken back over. Certain civilizations are immersed underwater. Nature has taken back over. So again, you can alter nature temporarily, but nature will always triumph. Nature will always win. Melanin is nature.
Civil rights is a waste of time. Because again, you're using a very broad term. If you see these women groups out here, what are they doing? They're looking for women's rights. What are you looking for? They're looking for veteran rights. What are you looking for? I'm looking for Indian rights. What are you looking for? I'm looking for Hispanic rights. What are you looking for? I'm looking for Arab rights. What are you looking for? I'm looking for gay rights. Until you get to black folk. You're not looking for, they're looking for civil rights. Who in the world is civil?
You know, there's a lot of shame that has, washed over poor black communities in particular, a lot of shaming and blaming, and we've got to end that and come together as a community and say we are committed to ending this system once and for all and open our hearts to young men returning home from prison rather than just wagging a finger at them and, saying, why can't you do better? There's a lot of reasons why folks aren't able to do better than they are today.
Do not think about racism in the term of hating anybody. Don't hate any whites, don't hate any Asians, don't hate any Arabs, don't hate anybody. It ain't about hating anybody. But neither is it about loving anybody. It's about learning how to compete economically as a group.
I have visited high schools and colleges and elementary schools where the predominant children are of European descent. And at the end of my presentation, they're hurt. Because they say, I don't have any problem identifying with Africa. If that's where I came from, that's where I came from. As you get older, and I've noticed it's right at the end of college going into post-college, that you have to buy into the untruth because that's the very essence of your being now. And much of what you get, whether it be a job or whether it be an advantage, comes from what's called white privilege. And out of this white privilege comes the ability to get things that you want. You want to feed your family. You want to take care of things. You want a job. But you want it fairly. You don't want it unfairly. You don't want to think that a whole group of people have been shunned out of a position because your skin color gave it to you. As you get older, it's hard to give that up, that privilege.
We begin to understand this is about behavior and our behavior towards nature. Black people just incidentally happen to be an object in nature. It is those who have behaved inappropriately, or most whites don't behave inappropriately. Most whites are actually as victimized as most people of color. Where the confusion is, because of the whiteness of skin, most whites think they will have an opportunity to ascend to the position of power of those who are doing the oppressing. And that's where their confusion comes in. Meanwhile, they suffer and tolerate that suffering, whereas others may resist it because we know we can never make that ascension.
Who protects the interests of this group? Who really protects the interests of this group? The ones who enslaved you are protecting your interests, even if they free you. That's like a rapist keeping you in prison For 10 years, raping you every day for 10 years. You insane with it. Then the 11th year, he says, I reached an epiphany, I was wrong. I shouldn't have did that. You're free to go. Now you're free to go. Go where? Free? Your whole heart is screwed up. Where you going? That same person says, okay, you can stay in one of my rooms called Chicago. You can stay in one of my rooms called New York. One of my rooms called Philly. Just follow the rules there in Philly and you'll be fine. I'm sorry for what I did. Here's reparation, no, not even reparation, here's affirmative action. Here's some justice in the courts. Here's a little money, here's a little economics. Here's a little access to something. I'll let you fight in our wars, and here's a little something. But for the most part, you're on your own now. Do you. Now here we are. Crazy, deranged, walking around, being raped for 300 years. Now you free. And your head is going, woo! But here's the point. You were God to begin with. This is what we forgot. This is what we forgot. You were God to begin with. So you did get beat, raped, punched, lynched, burned. But what happened? You're still here. And what is still here? Not the bodies that were burned, not the hangings, the innocent victims, but the spirit that created those people, the force that animates us, never dies.